You're a Royal Air Force pilot in 1941, streaking through the sky over the English Channel at 300 miles per hour. A German Messerschmitt drops onto your tail. Your training kicks in, push the stick forward, dive hard, use gravity to outrun him. But the moment you angle your Spitfire's nose down, your engine coughs, sputters, and dies. You're not flying anymore, you're falling. And in those few seconds of helpless silence, with the enemy closing in and the ground rushing up to meet you, you realize something terrifying. It's not the Germans killing you. It's your own aircraft. This was the nightmare that haunted RAF squadrons throughout 1940 and into 1941. Britain's legendary Spitfire, the sleek, beautiful fighter that supposedly embodied British engineering excellence, had a fatal flaw. And no one, not the top designers at Rolls-Royce, not the brilliant minds at the Air Ministry, not the decorated test pilots or veteran engineers, could figure out how to fix it. No one, that is, except a woman who wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. Her name was Beatrice Shilling, but everyone called her Tilly, and she was about to save the Battle of Britain with a piece of metal no bigger than a coin. But before we get to that moment of genius, we need to understand just how desperate things had become. Because by early 1941, Britain was losing the air war, not because of pilot skill, not because of tactics, but because of physics. The Germans had figured something out. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters could do something the Spitfires couldn't. They could dive, really dive. When a dogfight turned vertical, when gravity became a weapon, the Messerschmitt pilots would simply push their control sticks forward and plunge toward the earth at terrifying speeds. Their engines kept running. Their guns kept firing. But the Spitfires, the moment they nosed over into a steep dive, their Rolls-Royce Merlin engines would starve, cough, and quit. The propeller would windmill uselessly. And for 5, maybe 10 seconds, an eternity in combat, the British pilot became a sitting duck. Can you imagine that? You've trained for months, maybe years. You've earned your wings. You've been told you're flying the finest aircraft ever built. And then in the moment you need it most, when your life depends on a split-second maneuver, your engine betrays you. Some pilots didn't make it through those 10 seconds. They never got the engine restarted before the Messerschmitt's cannons found them. Others managed to pull out of the dive just in time, hearts pounding, hands shaking, knowing they'd just stared death in the face because of a mechanical fault. The problem was reported again and again. Squadron leaders sent urgent memos. Test pilots filed detailed reports. Mechanics scratched their heads in frustration. And at Rolls-Royce headquarters, the best engineering minds in Britain went to work on the problem. They knew what was causing it. The Merlin engine used a float-type carburetor to mix fuel and air, a design borrowed from automobile engines. It worked beautifully in level flight, even in gentle maneuvers, but physics is unforgiving. When you tip a Spitfire into a negative G dive, the fuel in that carburetor doesn't flow smoothly to the engine. Instead, it floods forward, overwhelming the system. Too much fuel, not enough air. The mixture becomes too rich. The engine chokes. The Germans had solved this problem years earlier with fuel injection systems. Their engines didn't rely on gravity and floating mechanisms. They forced fuel directly into the cylinders under pressure, regardless of the aircraft's attitude. It was elegant. It was sophisticated. It was German engineering at its finest. But Britain didn't have fuel injection. Redesigning the Merlin engine from scratch would take months, maybe years. It would require retooling entire factories, retraining thousands of workers, grounding squadrons for modifications. And Britain didn't have months. Every day, German bombers crossed the channel. Every day, RAF pilots scrambled to meet them. Every day, more aircraft were lost. The Air Ministry was desperate. Rolls-Royce was desperate. The entire RAF was desperate. And that's when Tilly Shilling walked into the room. Now, here's the thing about Tilly that you need to understand. In 1941, women weren't supposed to be in that room. They weren't supposed to be designing aircraft engines. They weren't supposed to be anywhere near the cutting edge of military technology. But Tilly had never particularly cared what she was supposed to do. Born in 1909, Beatrice Shilling had fallen in love with engines as a child. Not dolls, not domestic arts. Engines, motorcycles specifically. While other girls her age were learning needlework, Tilly was taking apart motorcycle carburetors in her father's workshop, teaching herself how internal combustion worked, getting grease under her fingernails and loving every minute of it. She studied mechanical engineering at the University of Manchester, one of the few women in a program designed by men for men. She earned her degree with distinction. Then she did something almost unheard of. She earned a master's degree in engineering. And then, because apparently she enjoyed breaking barriers, she got a job at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. By 1940, Tilly Shilling was one of the only female engineers working on military aircraft in Britain. She rode a motorcycle to work every day, often racing male colleagues and beating them. She spoke her mind in meetings where men expected women to stay silent. She had opinions about engine design, about aerodynamics, about the fundamental principles that kept aircraft in the sky. And when she heard about the Spitfire's dive problem, she didn't just read the reports. She thought about it, really thought about it. The Rolls-Royce engineers were trying to completely redesign the carburetor. They were pursuing complex solutions, sophisticated modifications, engineering marvels that would take months to develop and longer to implement. They were thinking like engineers who had time. But Tilly was thinking like someone who understood that pilots were dying right now. Today, this afternoon, over Dover or Southampton or the cliffs of Cornwall, she approached the problem differently. What if you couldn't stop the fuel from flooding forward during a dive? What if, instead, you just limited how much fuel could reach the carburetor in the first place? It was almost insultingly simple. Instead of redesigning the entire fuel system, what if you just put a restriction in the line? A small metal disc with a precisely calibrated hole drilled through it. The fuel would have to flow through that hole before reaching the carburetor. In level flight, it wouldn't matter, plenty of fuel would get through. But in a dive, when the fuel tried to flood forward, the restriction would limit the flow. It would keep the mixture from becoming too rich. The engine would keep running. Tilly did the calculations. She determined the exact diameter the hole needed to be. Too large and it wouldn't solve the problem. Too small and it would starve the engine of fuel in normal flight, robbing the Spitfire of power when it needed it most. She fabricated the disc herself. A simple piece of metal no bigger than a large coin with a hole precisely drilled through the center. It weighed almost nothing. It cost almost nothing. It could be installed in a Spitfire's fuel line in minutes. The male engineers at Rolls-Royce were skeptical. This woman, this motorcycle-riding, convention-breaking female engineer was proposing to solve a problem that had stumped their best minds with a piece of metal and a hole. But desperation makes people open-minded, and someone agreed to test it. They installed Tilly's disc in a Spitfire. A test pilot took it up. He climbed to altitude, rolled inverted, and pushed into a steep, screaming dive, the exact maneuver that had killed so many pilots. The engine kept running. He pulled out of the dive, climbed again, tried it harder, steeper angle, more negative GS. The kind of dive that would have cut the engine instantly before. The engine kept running. They tested it again and again. Different aircraft, different pilots, dive after dive after dive. The engine kept running. Word spread through the RAF like wildfire. There was a fix, a real fix, not a complicated redesign that would take months. Not a sophisticated system that required factory modifications. A disc, a hole, something that could be manufactured by the thousands and installed in every Spitfire in the fleet almost immediately. They called it Miss Shilling's Orifice. In an era when women were rarely credited for their work, when female engineers were invisible in official reports, the RAF pilots, the men whose lives she'd saved, made sure everyone knew exactly who had solved the problem. And it wasn't just that the engines kept running. Tilly's fix gave the Spitfires an unexpected advantage. With the restriction in place, pilots could now safely push their aircraft into steeper, more aggressive dives. They could follow the Messerschmitts down instead of having to roll away and lose the advantage. They could turn the enemy's own tactic against them. Testing showed that the modified Spitfires gained an extra 22 miles per hour at low altitude. 22 miles per hour might not sound like much, but in a dogfight, when you're turning hard at 6,000 feet with a German on your tail, 22 miles per hour is the difference between escape and cannon fire tearing through your cockpit. 22 miles per hour is the difference between life and death. By mid-1941, thousands of Spitfires had been modified with Miss Shilling's Orifice. The installation took a mechanic about 15 minutes, a tiny piece of metal. A precisely calculated hole. And suddenly, British pilots could fight on equal terms. The letters started coming in from squadrons across Britain. Pilots who'd lived through negative G dives that would have been fatal months earlier. Squadron leaders reporting improved combat performance. Mechanics marveling at how something so simple could make such a dramatic difference. Tilly Shilling had done what the entire British aviation establishment couldn't do. Not with a revolutionary breakthrough. Not with months of research and development, but with clear thinking, fundamental engineering principles, and a willingness to question whether the complicated solution was always the right solution. She'd saved lives. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. We'll never know the exact number, never know how many pilots came home to their families because their engines didn't quit in a dive over the channel. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Tilly didn't stop there. She didn't retire on her laurels, didn't spend the rest of the war being celebrated as the woman who saved the Spitfire. Instead, she went back to work. She continued developing engine improvements. She worked on supercharger systems, on fuel mixtures, on the endless technical challenges of keeping aircraft flying and fighting. After the war, she became one of Britain's leading experts on engine performance. She was awarded the Order of the British Empire. She was elected to the Royal Aeronautical Society, and she kept riding motorcycles. Well into her later years, Tilly Shilling could be found racing through the English countryside on 2 wheels, helmet on, throttle wide open, still in love with engines and speed and the pure joy of mechanical perfection. She never sought glory. She never demanded credit. She just did the work. Think about that for a moment. In 1941, Britain was fighting for its survival. The Battle of Britain had been won, but barely. The Luftwaffe was still a deadly threat. Every advantage mattered. Every improvement in aircraft performance could mean the difference between victory and defeat. And the solution to one of the RAF's most critical problems came from a woman working in a field that barely acknowledged women existed. It came from someone who thought differently, who wasn't trapped by conventional engineering wisdom, who understood that sometimes the simplest answer is the right answer. How many other women were there like Tilly? How many brilliant minds were ignored because of their gender? How many problems went unsolved because the people in charge refused to listen to unconventional voices? We'll never know. But we know about Tilly. We know about Miss Shilling's Orifice. We know that when it mattered most, when British pilots needed a miracle, an overlooked female engineer delivered one with a piece of metal and a precisely drilled hole. The Germans never figured out why the Spitfires suddenly became so much more dangerous in dive attacks. Their intelligence services never learned about Miss Shilling's Orifice. It was such a simple modification, so easy to overlook, that it remained effectively invisible. But the RAF pilots knew. They knew that the woman on the motorcycle, the engineer that some people thought didn't belong in the room, had given them back their aircraft, had given them a fighting chance, had given them their lives. Eventually, Rolls-Royce did develop a proper fuel injection system for the Merlin engine. It was sophisticated, complex, everything an engineer could want. But it took until 1943 to get it into production. By then, Miss Shilling's Orifice had been keeping Spitfires flying through dives for 2 years. 2 years. 2 years of combat, 2 years of dogfights, 2 years of pilots pushing their aircraft to the limit and knowing the engine wouldn't quit on them. All because one woman refused to accept that a problem was too complicated to solve simply. Tilly Shilling died in 1990 at the age of 81. The obituaries remembered her contributions to aviation engineering, her pioneering work in a male-dominated field, her passion for motorcycles and speed. But I wonder how many people truly understood what she'd accomplished. She hadn't just fixed an engine problem. She'd proven that genius doesn't care about gender, that the best solution isn't always the most complex one, that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person you need. So the next time you hear about the Battle of Britain, about the heroic Spitfire pilots who stood between Britain and Nazi invasion, remember this. Those pilots survived because of many people. The designers who created the Spitfire, the factory workers who built them, the mechanics who maintained them, the commanders who deployed them, and a woman named Tilly who saved hundreds of lives with a piece of metal no bigger than a coin. Because sometimes, the most important holes in history are the ones nobody sees coming.